4 points I would like to mention. You could have a look at the impact of a scholar to evoke PhDs or other qualification works or other secondary literature on this scholar. You could evoke some book reviews about the work you have done, and if you have many book reviews by other authors writing on your book in book reviews, that this might be a good way to improve your work impact. Third point, I would like to a little bit delve into Fromm's impact on main scholarly contributions, on the one hand to the theology of the Old Testament and other more or less hermeneutical studies, and on the other hand to more descriptive, historical, critical, descriptive studies within Hebrew Bible studies. And the last point, shortly a survey of the need for the application of Fromm's ideas in Hebrew Bible studies. This is first point, the impact of Erich Fromm's Bible studies by evoking PhDs or similar kinds of secondary literature works. Here you find a list of 6-7 books writing on Erich Fromm and Erich Fromm's work on religion, and parts of these books at least also deal with Erich Fromm's research on the Hebrew Bible. Most of these books are PhDs or building upon their own PhD works and making a book out of it, with some exceptions, for example the last one. Anyway, all of these are written not by scholars within the field of the Hebrew Bible in itself, but more in a broad way on all of Fromm's approach to religion. But anyway, it is, of course, a way to measure a little bit the impact of Erich Fromm's work in the field of religion and also a little bit on the Hebrew Bible, because these authors are mainly outlining what Fromm wrote on the Hebrew Bible and sometimes also evaluating this. Second, Fromm's, and here I haven't looked at all of the book reviews about all of Fromm's work. I just take one example, namely Fromm's main contribution to the Hebrew Bible, his "You Shall Be as Gods." Does he receive book reviews by other scholars on this? Yes, he does, a little bit at least. First, book reviews by other Old Testament scholars on Fromm's contribution to the Hebrew Bible. One example, Eugene Merli, the professor of the Old Testament from the US, and this is a quotation, but the entire picture, and this quotation is published in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly, quite a well-known Old Testament research journal, but the entire picture, quotation, rests on an interpretation of the Hebrew Bible that can be termed at best eclectic and at worst eisegetical. Rather than an interpretation of the Old Testament, the book is an interpretation of certain passages which are manipulated to support a preconceived hypothesis. Another example by an Old Testament scholar, Donald Gowan, also a professor of Old Testament from the US, quotation from the Pittsburgh Perspective: "The impression which this work makes on an Old Testament specialist is that we have here no interpretation of the Old Testament, but a scheme whose origin has nothing to do with the Bible at all, into which a few Bible stories and rabbinic sayings have been fitted. The result of doing so has been in almost every case to make them say something their authors did not want to say." Well, I am not the bad guy here. I'm just quoting another author. You could also ask the question, does Erich Fromm's contribution to the Hebrew Bible receive book reviews not within Hebrew Bible research, but in other theological or other kinds of scientific journals, taking up "You Shall Be as Gods" and writing a review on this Hebrew Bible book. And one example is Erwin Bloch, a professor of philosophy from the US, and he wrote in the well-known journal Tradition, a journal of Orthodox Jewish thought, a book review on Erich Fromm's You Shall Be as Gods. Two aspects, quotation. What is puzzling about Fromm's exegesis is his selectivity. He selects some things from the Bible to illustrate his view, but ignores others that do not fall in line. Or if he does not ignore them, he calls them archaic, arguing that the final editor, an ancient humanist who left the archaic passages in the text for some reason or other. And Fromm appears to assume the following: since humanism is good and authoritarianism is bad, and all admit the Bible to be essentially good, therefore the Bible must be essentially humanistic, and all traces of authoritarianism must be due to earlier bad influences, archaic. This kind of reasoning needs no comment. So this kind of critical review by Old Testament scholars, but also by other scholars, is quite typical. Criticizing Fromm for being here, for laying a scheme upon the Hebrew Bible and saying something he wants to say from his own humanistic approach. But especially the book reviews, not by Old Testament scholars, on his book on the Hebrew Bible, also have sometimes a little bit a differentiated critique, so also Erwin Bloch, yet there are some good features of the book. Fromm's discussion of idolatry is the best, and I think the finest description of the Jewish notion of idolatry in English. However, to utilize it, he means here radical humanism, as a tool in interpreting and understanding the Torah and Judaism is a clear example of el-wonoshe Torah, the willful misuse of Torah that one might find. And one last example here is by Rabbi Gertel in the journal Judaism. This is not a big book review on You Shall Be as Gods itself. It is more an article on Erich Fromm and Erich Fromm's views on the Hebrew Bible and Judaism and religion in general. Quotation: like Jewish homiletics of all ages, Fromm's interpretation of Scripture ranged from brilliant insights into the plain meaning of the Bible to shameless forcing of the biblical text, in Fromm's case to fit psychoanalytic dogmas. But Fromm's best insights into the Bible more than compensate for any forced characterizations we might encounter. You Shall Be as Gods contains many important interpretations of biblical texts, and there is not a knowledgeable Jewish preacher who at one time or another has not cited Fromm's brilliant defense of the Sabbath in the forgotten language. Just to give you an overview, there are some other book reviews on Fromm's You Shall Be as Gods, showing that this book had, at least in the first years, quite an impact in the field and also in other fields of theological or psychological work. My third point, Fromm's impact on scholarly contributions to the Hebrew Bible, to the theology of the Old Testament, pertaining to the theology of the Old Testament, a classical subfield within Hebrew Bible research, as well as other literary and more hermeneutical approaches. There are a lot of side references where scholars quote and cite Erich Fromm just as a sideline, in passing by, in footnotes and so on. And I am not, because of time troubles, not going deeper into this. Walter Brückemann, for example, quite an important figure in the US, dealing mainly with Old Testament theology, once in a while cites Fromm in a footnote, but not more. The same goes to John Rogerson, also quite famous professor of Old Testament from Sheffield in England, who has himself is very interested in a critical theory of the Frankfurt School and so forth. He also sometimes cites from in a footnote. Bernhard Lang, I should say greeting from Bernhard Lang to you. Sure. I forgot to say this yesterday. Bernhard Lang will publish an article, 3 Philosophers in Paradise, Kant, Tillich and Ricoeur interpret and respond to Genesis 2 and 3. And here, and this I would like to mention because this might be interesting also for you, here he's dealing with Kant and Schiller and showing that the Eden narrative, the story of the fall of Adam and Eve, is interpreted already, of course, from Enlightenment on by scholars like Kant and then Schiller, not as a story of a fall and a bad event, but as a fortunate event that helps the development of human mind for the capacity of reason. And here, Bernhard Lang is dealing with these scholars, and then he has a footnote stating, well, Erich Fromm is just sitting on these shoulders with his book, You Shall Be as Gods, so this is not something really quite new, but this is a typical Enlightenment thought Fromm has here. Perhaps for our conference today, a little bit more interesting is where Fromm is cited more broadly in these subfields of Hebrew Bible research. We have Uwe Steffen, Jona und der Fisch. This is a book where this author quotes a lot of different literary approaches to the book of Jonah, and here also Fromm receives 1-2 pages where the author more or less mainly outlines what Fromm was saying in the forgotten language on the book of Jonah. We have Axel Preminger and Edward Greenstein, a professor from Israel. They edited a book, The Hebrew Bible in Literary Criticism. Literary criticism means in the Anglo-Saxon world approaches from literary perspectives, not the German meaning Literarkritik, so we just have to be aware of this. And here they cite a lot of different literary approaches to the Bible, and Fromm also receives here 1-2 pages and is quoted once on with You Shall Be as Gods, dealing with the Psalms, and another chapter of this book dealing with Jonah also cites the forgotten language. Another example by there's a book by Van Hahn and Bent Strawn, Old Testament scholars. They added a book, Psalms for Preaching and Worship. We see we are still here in the hermeneutical stream of scholarly research. In this book on the Psalms, they have an introduction to the field, and here they deal with the problem of the shift of mood in the lament psalms. You have the problem that in some lament psalms you have a so-called shift of mood, that the psalmist, first and foremost, is praying and stating his problems and his suffering, and then suddenly, in one way or another, he is able to have a vow of praise, a trust of confidence, and so forth. And the question in scholarship is, how is this possible, this change of mood? And here the authors deal with quite typical old-fashioned theories. Well, there was a priest in the temple saying, everything is fine, don't worry. And then the psalmist can say, oh, fine, I can go on to my shift of mood in my psalm. This is a very typical approach, old-fashioned one. But here these scholars also cite Erich Fromm's approach, having a psychodynamic understanding of this shift of mood in the lament psalms. Is there an impact of Fromm's research on descriptive and historical exegetical studies? So another subfield within Old Testament research, more or less historical interests. Again, we have a lot of, well, not a lot of, but we have some side references just in passing by. And because of time troubles, I don't want to delve deeper into this. But Rüdiger Lux, having in his book on Jonah, he has something on the research history of the book of Jonah, and here he also mentions Erich Fromm. Giovanni Garbini, a professor of Semitics from Rome, in his book Myth and the History of the Bible, has in his last chapter, at the end of Myth, he goes on saying that reason, there will be a development from myth to reason, and here he also cites Hermann Cohen and then Erich Fromm. Bernhard Levinson, a specialist in law, ancient Near Eastern and biblical law, in his book The Right Chorale, is mentioning You Shall Be as Gods just as one example for non-historical approaches to the Old Testament. And I myself will be publishing an article on cultural traumata in the ancient Near East, where I also short, more or less passing by, mention Erich Fromm's approach to trauma from the art of listening. And here again, perhaps more interesting is, do we have a full application of Fromm's ideas in this subfield of scholarly work? Albert Rabin, not an Old Testament scholar, but a professor of psychology, wrote a book on the Old Testament, Psychological Issues in Biblical Law, Explorations in the Old Testament. And here he is dealing with some aspects within the Hebrew Bible where the authors show that they have the capacity to think of their own death. And here he's dealing with man for himself, citing man for himself. He is delving into the Song of Songs. This is an erotic love song book in the Hebrew Bible, where he is then also citing man for himself. And dealing with dreams in the Hebrew Bible, he is, of course, also mentioning the forgotten language. In the end, this is all in 5, 6, 7 pages, Erich Fromm within this book. Andrew Killer, once again, not an Old Testament scholar, but a biblical scholar interested very much in psychology. He wrote a book, Psychological Biblical Criticism, where he has a chapter comparing Erich Fromm's interpretation of the Eden narrative with the Hebrew Bible scholar interpreting this narrative also psychologically, Lynn Bechtel. He says both authors are among the best in a psychological interpretation of the Eden narrative. Lynn Bechtel has the theory that Adam and Eve narrative is not a story of the fall, like Erich Fromm, but a story saying something about the development of the human mind from childhood to adolescence to the mature stage of the human mind. And in the end, Andrew Killer says, though Fromm's theory is also very good, in the end he likes Lynn Bechtel's theory better. Quotation, Fromm's theory ignores details that do not fit. His theory is predominant. He subordinates the text to theory. Although both Fromm and Bechtel agree that the traditional sin and fall model for interpreting Genesis 2 and 3 is misleading, Fromm's exegesis still owes much to that very model. That's interesting. He asserts that the act of disobedience entails no cosmic alteration in human nature or the world, but that the essence of the tale is still to be found in disobedience, rebellion, and punishment by a jealous God. So the category of thinking is still within authoritarianism. For myself, very interesting, and I think a very good article is by Rüdiger Bartemus, a professor of Old Testament from Greifswald University, who has a full application, positively, a full application of to have or to be to the anthropology of Ecclesiastes. In a quite well-known Old Testament journal, Biblische Notizen, haben oder seien Anmerkungen zur Anthropologie des Buches Kohelet. And this is a full application here of Fromm's differentiation of attitudes behind acts. Ecclesiastes is dealing with man's capacity to think of faith as his own destiny. We all have faith, death as our destiny. Ecclesiastes is dealing with this, and what can we do? What does Ecclesiastes see as different ways of dealing with our own consciousness that we have to die? And Barthelus here says, in the face of death as man's destiny, Ecclesiastes presents two different attitudes. Man can try to have things, work to do, frantic activeness as a way of striving after wind. Typical idiom in the book of Ecclesiastes. This way of to have is a striving after wind. Or man can try to be, to rejoice, to enjoy, to relish as a way of living according to man's share in this world, because this is man's share in the world, to rejoice and to enjoy and so forth. Perhaps you know, I have to mention this, I think, also just shortly, that I wrote an article for the Festschrift for Reiner Funk, Die Kunst der Freundschaft, where I take up the Hebrew term emunah, steadfastness, veracity, and try to take up also from the art of loving. Loving is an art, and ask myself the question, how is this then with friendship? And looking at the ancient sources we have, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and ancient Israel, on friendship and this Hebrew term emunah that appears here in a lot of sources and similar Egyptian and cuneiform terms. Last point, the survey of the need for the application of Fromm's ideas in Hebrew Bible studies. First point I want to mention here is Erich Fromm and the Psalms. I think Erich Fromm's genre criticism is still very interesting for scholarship in the Psalms, and this hasn't been really applied to research on the Psalms. This one book I quoted is an exception, but otherwise Erich Fromm's genre criticism of psychodynamic different genres of Psalms do not appear in Hebrew Bible research. You won't find it otherwise. So this could be taken up and be delved upon by connecting it to modern interpretations of this change of mood. I just mentioned a very old-fashioned approach. We have other modern tries, explanations for this shift of mood, and one very good one, I think, that is not mentioned by this book I was quoting is performative explanations, and this could very well be complemented by Fromm's psychodynamic approach. Or perhaps you know we have some difficult psalms also in the Hebrew Bible, psalms of vengeance, where the psalmist wants to have vengeance against others who are approaching him in a not very friendly way. And how to deal with this psalms of vengeance. This is a hermeneutical problem, and it might be interesting to take up Fromm's differentiation between defensive aggressiveness and malignant aggression in trying to understand these psalms. Perhaps you know there is an ongoing discussion on the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible not being as good as all the quotations I had before that, but being intolerant, inherently intolerant in modern discussions. Think of Jan Assmann's book, The Price of Monotheism, stating that within the Hebrew Bible there turns up the differentiation between true and false. And some religions are true and others are false. And with this kind of thinking, beyond polytheism, there comes inherently within in the level of the religious thinking system, there is inherently integrated with this an intolerant way of thinking. And this has been taken up by a lot of scholars dealing with this. On Perlentaucher.de there was a big discussion on this. Peter Sloterdijk has several books also on this. His recent essay, Im Schatten des Sinai, takes up the story, second book of Moses, where the story of the golden calf, where a lot of priests slay the others who had their golden calf image and just slay them and kill them because they had their wrong image. And what a lot of scholars do not know, Jörg Remiers, in his PhD on Erich Fromm, also takes up especially this chapter and says, look at this, the Hebrew Bible is not that humanistic, and with Erich Fromm having his fight against idolatry is also showing a very intolerant way of thinking. The author of humanistic ideas is himself intolerant and authoritarianism against all these nice polytheistic thinkers who just want to have their nice images. And my suggestion here in this kind of discussion, one could think of taking up Fromm's emphasis on different attitudes and orientations, character orientations behind official ideas and doctrines on the level of religious thinking, and show how the ongoing discussion is all too idealistic in a Weberian sense, and that Fromm's differentiation between authoritarian and humanistic religion runs through all existing religions, theistic and also non-theistic religions. This says Fromm also explicitly in Psychoanalysis and Religion, I think. My last point, the legacy and application of Erich Fromm's social analytic model and differentiation of character orientation. Jürgen Hardig already pointed out that some scholars say, well, the first Erich Fromm, the early Erich Fromm is scientifically quite interesting. The other half of it we do not deal with this at universities. Well, I do not agree with this kind of way of thinking, but still the early Erich Fromm is very interesting in taking up also in religious sciences and in Hebrew Bible studies, especially if you take up this social analytic approach, get a little bit rid of the orthodox Freudian implicities therein and take up Fromm's later thinking of needs and social relatedness and so forth. And if you merge this, then you have a very good approach, I think, that could be complemented to theories that are similar. Because we have to be aware there are, of course, similar theories to Erich Fromm's social analytic theory. Think of the history of mentalities by medievalists. Think of the concept of habitus by the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Or I just want to shortly quote Clifford Geertz's definition of religion. This definition by Clifford Geertz is much more famous than Erich Fromm's. A religion is, quotation, a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. This is a definition by a cultural anthropologist. And you can see, of course, there are similarities to Erich Fromm's approach. But then what could Fromm add to this? And I think Fromm could add something to this because of this cultural anthropologist approaches, the social approaches are similar, but they have something, they do not have something that Fromm might add, and this is the psychodynamic aspect within Fromm's social analytic theory. And in this way, I think, for example, point 2 here about the powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations, this is speaking in a kind of psychological terms. And of course here, Erich Fromm could be complemented in a very well, I think. Also, we have to think of that Fromm's theory of his social analytic theory is not a static theory, but it is an evolutionary theory. It's a dynamic theory. And if we look at the newer research within religious sciences or the Hebrew Bible, evolutionary concepts become stronger again. They were out of thinking in the 70s, 80s, 90s. No one wanted to think in evolutionary terms, but now this is emerging very strongly in research again. Think of the sociologist, the late Robert Bellah, Religion and Human Evolution, or also within Hebrew Bible research. A lot of work is being done on the history of religion within ancient Israel. so in evolutionary terms. And here as well, these research is also arguing very much sociology in social terms. And here as well, Fromm could very well complement with this psychodynamic aspect, because this is something Fromm could add, the others do not have. Yes, perhaps the real need and drive to have something to eat and drink now might turn up again, and the sublimation may be done with. Thank you very much for listening.